switch to English to introduce John Krige. It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce him, and I thank him very much for having accepted our invitation. He's a Regents and Kranzberg Emeritus Professor in the School of History and Sociology in the Georgia Institute of Technology, because there is a School of History and Sociology at Georgia Institute of Technology, and there are many also in MIT and other institutes of technology around the world. And he is an historian of science who played a crucial role in the development of our discipline of the history of science and technology. He pioneered approaches and questions related to the interplay of the production and circulation of knowledge, in scientific and technological knowledge, interplay of this production and circulation with the development of international relations, especially with the development of US foreign policies. And now the field has become very strong within the history of science, and it's certainly John Krige is one of the main leading figures and the most authoritative voices in this growing and attractive field. John Krige authored more than 200 publications, many of which with high-level impact in our discipline. I will not mention all of them. Just let me remind the audience that he has been crucial in the historical project on the development of many European institutions, including CERN and the European Space Agency, and for pointing out the role of US foreign policies in the reconstruction in Europe, of scientific reconstruction in Europe after World War II. In the last year, he published two important books, Knowledge Regulation and National Security in Post-War America, and the edited volume, Knowledge Flows in a Global Age, a Transnational Approach. We will learn more of this book in the talk he will give now, with the provocative title, Were We Ever at Peace? The Irreversible Entanglement of Science, Politics and Regimes of Knowledge Control. Please, John, now the floor is yours. We will leave this.
And I actually would like to remind you that there will be a light lunch after the event.
Can you hear me? Honorable Rector, Professor Sacchi, Roberto, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I really am deeply honored to open the series of lectures in the SEUS on which engages interdisciplinary work in science, technology, and society. As you may know, I was first trained as a physicist. I became aware that my field had become highly politicized. I decided to retrain myself as a social scientist. I did a history and philosophy of science, second history and philosophy of science PhD. And so now I spent the rest of my life working at the intersection between science, technology, and society, and what we now say in something of a cliche, the mutual shaping of society and science and technology. So this is very much the world that I'm passionately engaged in, and today I want to share some of my latest thoughts about some of the issues that are rather burning in our intellectual and personal lives. And my talk is about 35 minutes. I'll try not to speak too fast. Of course, it's in English. I do speak Italian, but rather badly. But you can ask me questions in Italian if you like, and Roberto can help me if I don't understand them. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February last year, and the decision to combine military action with economic sanctions to punish its aggression, has had multiple impacts on each and every one of us in many different ways. Specifically, as members of a global intellectual community, we've been called on to isolate our Russian colleagues, to stop ongoing collaborative projects if possible, and not to undertake any new research projects that involve state support. What is more, Russia is not the only country in the collimator of Western governments when it comes to transnational scientific and technological collaboration. The other one is, of course, China. The US government has put immense pressure on the science and engineering research community to reduce its collaborative activities with China, even to stop them altogether. An anti-communist agenda has always been central to American foreign policy, of course, but it is massively intensified and expanded in scope, first by President Trump and now by President Biden. The demand that we cut off scientific collaboration with colleagues in two authoritarian regimes has been strongly contested and criticized by many, less on political grounds than as a matter of principle. That principle is enshrined in the Enlightenment value of scientific internationalism, a value that decouples the circulation of scientific knowledge from national political agendas. I hope this works. A Japanese astrophysicist that directs a new research center in Beijing recently stated this principle in very clear language. Scientific activity is international and knows no borders, the total opposite of national ideas. Every scientific achievement is the common property of humanity. From this point of view, there can be no political justification for breaking off scientific relations with Russia or China. The products of science and technology, or at least of fundamental research, tell us basic truths about the world that transcend national boundaries and belong to all and flourish only when they are left to circulate free of state control. For the last 2 decades, this noble ideal has inspired an entire field of inquiry that goes under the name of science diplomacy that has been discussed here recently. I don't want to go over this debate about science diplomacy here, but what I want to say today is relevant to it. Put very simply, science diplomacy, which links science and foreign policy, exploits the tradition of scientific internationalism to create space for international collaboration between scientists from countries that are politically, if not militarily, at war with one another, or at least in which there's tensions between them. By sharing scientific knowledge understood as the common property of humanity across national borders, scientists hope to reduce tensions and enable governments to arrive at rational solutions to global problems like climate change and nuclear proliferation. My central claim in this short talk is that the principle of scientific internationalism, the principle of scientific internationalism is obsolete, at least in the form expressed by my Japanese astrophysicist. I want to insist that every scientific achievement is not, in practice, the common property of humanity. On the contrary, I want to argue that structural changes in the practice of fundamental research, led by the United States, have coupled fundamental research ever more tightly with national military and economic power. The transnational circulation of much of the knowledge produced by this incredibly dynamic research ecosystem cannot be the common property of humanity if it is tightly coupled to national and military interests in a competitive geopolitical context, whether the research community likes it or not. As the deputy director of the CIA put it as early as 1980s, have I got this? No, scientists do not immunize themselves from social responsibility simply because they're engaged in a scientific pursuit. These then are the stakes in my paper today. On the one hand, oops, my screen on the left is not oh, sorry, that's me that's getting mixed up. On the one hand, you have a research community that insists in the name of scientific internationalism that at least fundamental research in science and engineering should circulate freely across national borders. And the whole push for open access, of course, is linked to this, right? And on the other hand, you have a government apparatus that insists that today the global circulation of that knowledge in a competitive geopolitical system poses major dangers to national security, and that its flow across national borders must be regulated by state intervention. The essentials of my argument are spelled out in my new book, published with Mario Daniels, Knowledge Regulation and National Security. Sorry, I'm getting a bit confused with all these screens. Knowledge Regulation and National Security in Post-War America, published in April 2022, with the other one on the right in September 22. This sounds like an American story. But on the other hand, it is of direct significance to us. Consider this. An American colleague of mine who researches in the field of terahertz imaging, so it's very fundamental research, invited a Chinese student, a Chinese postdoc, to join his lab and work with him as a student. The government of the country where the lab was refused the student a visa. The student did not come. The point of the story is that the lab is in France, and the government that refused the visa to the Chinese student was the French government, not the American government. So in other words, we are having in Europe now what is called an awakening to the rise of China. And more governments are interfering and objecting to students from China in particular, and of course now also from Russia, from coming to study in our democracies. With these preliminaries behind me, let me enter the body of my paper. The talk is divided into 3 main sections. First, I will define the character of the knowledge that I'm talking about here that is central of my central concern in this argument. Then I will describe the constellation of factors in the 1980s that led the American government to regulate its global circulation to the communist bloc, both in international trade and in academia. In the third section, I will drill down into the high-profile case at Harvard University in which a distinguished nanoscientist named Charles Lieber faces several years in prison for sharing his research experience with students and faculty in China. To conclude, I will return to the main theme of my talk and discuss the reaction of his colleagues to the charges brought against Lieber by the Department of Justice. And once again, I will emphasize that the limits of their appeal to scientific internationalism and to science diplomacy, as I see them in today's geopolitical context. So first, let me talk about what knowledge am I talking about. It's not all kinds of knowledge. The United States emerged as the undisputed military and economic power on the globe after World War II. To secure a preponderance of power, it quickly moved to maintain a monopoly over raw materials needed for producing nuclear weapons and protect the knowledge that went into designing and producing them behind a wall of patents and classification. Everybody understood and understands that classified knowledge is strictly controlled and cannot be shared freely with anyone without government authority. Knowledge that was not classified, however, could be published openly and was available to anyone, anywhere. All of this big division between fundamental research that can circulate freely and classified knowledge controlled by the government, that's standard fare. We all understand that. But what is usually ignored is that the Truman administration simultaneously extended a system of export controls not only over commodities, things that you put in a box and ship abroad like a high-performance computer, but over what they call technical data, a particular kind of knowledge that was deemed sensitive from a national security point of view, but not so sensitive that it had to be classified. There are 3 points to stress here. First, there is a vast category of knowledge which is basically dual use. So shall we say GPS, your GPS system, which is just as good for steering a missile against a Russian tank as it is for finding your way from the city to the Politecnico di Torino. Okay, so it's dual use. And many, many others. High-performance computers that can be used to model weather and can be used to model nuclear explosions. So there's this huge category of dual-use knowledge that is too sensitive to be allowed to circulate freely, but not sensitive enough to be classified. Secondly, this regulation is enshrined by laws in which we usually think of simply as applying to commodities, as I say, but that also impact the circulation of this kind of knowledge called technical data, knowledge, but also know-how and software. And thirdly, that these regulations, I'm summarizing the book, have spilled over into advanced university research, where the application and implementation has been and still is the subject of muscular negotiations between the academic community and the American government, and now increasingly European universities and their governments. For the first 2 decades of the Cold War, controls over the circulation of this kind of knowledge, including the transfer of know-how and tacit knowledge to the communist bloc, was not of great concern. The gap between America and the rest of the world was too important for them to worry. It was propelled to the heart of the regulatory regime in the 1970s during the period of détente. The Department of Defense found that trade missions from the Soviet Union that came to visit American firms like Boeing or IBM were not interested in buying anything. They were interested in understanding how the machinery worked. They were interested in understanding the technical data and knowledge and experience and tacit information and tacit knowledge that went into building these computers. They wanted every manual they could get. They wanted every engineer that had developed and built these machines. Because if they did that, they could go home and build them themselves and improve them, improve their performance. So the Department of Defense at that time took some measures to stop this happening by setting up an addition to the export control regime, which limited the flow of tacit knowledge and know-how to the Soviet bloc, but not a lot. But then came the shock. In 1981, French President François Mitterrand handed President Ronald Reagan a set of 4,000 KGB documents passed on to him by an agent, a double agent called Vetrov, who defected to France. These so-called farewell papers sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. As described by the Assistant Secretary of Commerce, they revealed that operating out of embassies, consulates, and so-called business delegations, KGB operatives have blanketed the developed capitalist countries with a network that operates like a gigantic vacuum cleaner. And look what they pick up, right? Not machines, obviously not with a vacuum cleaner, right? Formula, patents, blueprints, and know-how with frightening precision. The Deputy Director, universities were not spared. A senior official in the Department of Commerce stated that the Soviets were able to exploit the soft underbelly of American openness, including the desire of academia to jealously preserve its prerogative as a community of scholars unencumbered by government regulations. The Deputy Director of the CIA, Bobby Inman, went even further and was even more confrontational. There was a growing tension, he said, between the scientists' desire for unrestrained research and publication on the one hand, and the federal government's need to protect certain information from adversaries who may use this information against the nation. It was hollow. Inman went on to suggest that national security should not have an impact on scientific freedom. Scientists do not immunize themselves because they're engaged in a scientific pursuit. This bruising dispute between the government and the research community was resolved in 1985. On the one hand, Inman recognized that very little information, in fact, was leaking from American research universities to the Soviet bloc. On the other hand, a special panel was put in place and proposed successfully that a new system be put in place to protect what was called fundamental research in science and engineering that was openly published. All of that would not be restricted by the government. Fundamental research in science and engineering that is openly published in the literature would not be regulated in any way by the government. This principle was reaffirmed repeatedly, including by Condoleezza Rice after the attack on the World Trade Center, but it has been changed recently and considerably undermined and attacked since the arrival of President Trump in office. It's no surprise, perhaps, that a man who promised to make America great again, using protectionist measures, and who launched a technological trade war against China, should also make an attack on the academics' freedom of publication and on scientific internationalism. But it's much too easy to just criticize Trump as responsible for this major change in policy, since it has been pursued and actually reinforced by Biden, okay? This suggests that there's something deeper behind this, something deeper other than Trump's political agenda, okay? And the point about that is then what are these changes? There are structural changes behind all of this that is causing great anxiety to Trump, to Biden, and that in fact has bipartisan support in the United States. So now we need to become social scientists, pull away the veil of political rhetoric, and look behind that to see what has changed that has led to this transformation and deeper concern and constraints on sharing knowledge with China and with Russia. So I'm going into these three structural issues. Beginning in about 2018, there was increasing pressure inside the administration of the United States to restrict the global circulation of knowledge, including fundamental research, to meet new threats to American security. The argument was spelled out in the opening statement by the Republican chairman of the Senate Subcommittee of the Department of Homeland Security in 2019. And here it's very beautifully summed up the issue. America, he said, built the world's most successful research enterprise based on certain values, including collaboration, integrity, peer review, transparency, and improving the public good. The open and collaborative nature of research in America is one of the reasons that we attract the brightest and the best in the world. Some countries, however, have exploited America's openness to advance their own national interests. The most aggressive is China. For China, international scientific collaboration is not about advancing science for the global good. It is by their own admission about advancing China's national security and economic interests. They've been clear about it. China's stated goal is to be the world's leader in science and technology. There's lots of dubious things about this quotation, right? About what America's own practices are. But let's not worry about that. Let's concentrate on what he is saying. The implications of this attitude were spelt out by Christopher Wray, very handsome guy there, with Donald Trump. Christopher Wray is the head of the FBI with Donald Trump. And by the way, the day after Joe Biden was inaugurated, he reappointed Wray as the head of the FBI. And Wray, I think, is still the head of the FBI. So Wray spoke to the Senate Intelligence Committee and was asked by Marco Rubio, whom you may have heard of, to comment on what Rubio called the counterintelligence risk posed by US national security from Chinese students, particularly those in advanced programs in science and mathematics. You might have many of them here. May replied, the China threat is not just a whole of government threat, it's a whole of society threat. And I think it's going to take a whole of society response by us. Wray asserted later that everyone was in on it, including thousands of Chinese students and researchers who worked and studied in the US every year. Put plainly, he said in a very famous statement, China seems determined to steal its way up the economic ladder at our expense. The FBI director also deplored what he called the level of naivete on the part of the academic sector about this. They're exploiting the very open research and development environment that we have, which we all revere, but they're taking advantage of us. Targeting our information and ideas, our innovation, our research, our development, our technology. Well, I mean, it's quite odd to hear Wray saying this in 2019 when we heard exactly the same thing said by Inman in 1982, sorry. There is the same reference to the soft underbelly and easily exploitable openness of American academia, the same claims that academics are hopelessly naive about the threats that their work poses to national security, and the same threats that the government will have no option but to intervene and place tighter regulations on them, and on the international circulation of information with Russia and this China. So are we reliving the Cold War politics of the 1980s? I would say absolutely not. Because there's a fundamentally and important crucial structural differences between the geopolitical conflict today between the US and China and the one with the Soviet Union 40 years ago. It is also these structural differences that I'm going to start talking about now that are driving Biden and Trump. First, as I made clear above, is the exploitation of China's, First is the exploitation by China in its quest for economic dominance. The Soviet Union was a military threat. China is above all an economic threat to the United States, an increasingly military threat, but really it's an economic threat to the dominance of the United States. And that is something more than simply competition between two major economic powers. Today, free market economic competition needs to be regulated in the United States in the name of what they call economic security. It is a national security concern. Though the world's economic security are bandied about in the media, the concept has major implications for the role of the national security state. It also has a deep history. The importance of economic security can be traced back to the conflict between the United States and Japan in the 1980s, when the United States began to realize that Japan had an enormous amount of economic power which could actually be used as a lever against the United States. And it became clear to them that military power alone was not adequate to secure global power. One needed also economic power, hand in glove with military power. Japan proved it to them. And so they decided that there was an important need for the state to interfere in the economy, very much against the American way of thinking about things, to protect the security of the nation. And so that is the birth of the notion of economic security and of protectionist measures to stop certain kinds of economic practices which will be to the disadvantage of America's economic power and so its military power. The second domestic structural change since the Reagan years is the blurring of the boundary, and this is very important to me because it's not usually mentioned, between universities and the private sector, thanks to the commercialization of academic research. You may remember that the Bayh-Dole Act and subsequent laws in the 1980s gave universities patent and intellectual property rights over the results of their research funded by the federal government. In doing so, they liberated the entrepreneurial energies of the faculty, but they also made a huge contribution to the American economy. According to the President's Advisory Council on Science and Technology in 2012, today America's research universities are closer to the market place than they've ever been, with a focus on translating and transferring research discoveries to industry. In raw numbers, this means that from 1991 to 2010, the number of patent applications filed by universities rose to a total of 4,469 patents issued in financial year 2010 to 183 universities and other institutions. Income from these licenses soared to 2.4 billion in that same year, and also startup companies were supported. University research has been heavily commercialized. What does that mean? That on the research, development, invention, innovation spectrum, more and more work in universities is done at the innovation end, close to the market, close to the field, right? And they're strongly encouraged to do this because they can take out patents on it, and the federal government pumps a lot of money into university projects that are combined, in which a university professor is a PI and the partner is a business person. So the National Science Foundation supports this massively. This has become institutionalized. Why does that matter? This may be great for American academics and the American economy, but it poses a real threat to international collaboration with China, quite obviously. And that's the third major difference. The Bayh-Dole Act was signed into law in the 1980s when most campus visitors and students were from the Allies. Today, of course, as you know, there's a huge number of Chinese students who study on American university campuses. In the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, there are at least 5,000 PhDs from China, Chinese students who get PhDs in American universities every year. Over the last 10 years, 50,000 Chinese nationals have got PhDs from American universities in these STEM fields. Well, of course, all of them are learning to do fundamentally important research, which they can go home and patent immediately to the commercial advantage of the United States, of China, and therefore, by extension, to the disadvantage of the United States. For the Chinese authorities, these students are a remarkable asset in its determination to become a global leader in S&T. For the American authorities, they pose a major threat to American economic and eventually military security. Okay, that's the sort of intellectual, it's not theoretical, but that's the background, the social scientific background, and now I'm going to just briefly discuss one example of the kind of problem that we're dealing with. It concerns this man who I'm totally fascinated by, Charles Lieber. On January the 28th, 2020, so about 3 years ago, Charles Lieber, eminent Harvard professor, material scientist, nominated for the Nobel Prize several times, member of the 3 American academies, was led into a federal court in Boston in a yellow jumpsuit with handcuffs around his wrist. Lieber was accused by the Department of Justice of lying to the government and of lying to Harvard about his participation in China's 1,000 Talents program, a Beijing-sponsored military initiative to encourage prestigious researchers from abroad to spend up to 5 years in China, sharing their knowledge and their experience with faculty and students in that country. Lieber's participation amounted to setting up a mirror lab to his own nanotechnology lab in Boston to train students at the Wuhan University of Technology. Very famous. Wuhan is now very famous because of the COVID-19 issue. Lieber was released on bail of $1 million in cash, which shows you that he's quite a wealthy chap. And despite a spirited defense of his innocence, a federal jury found him guilty on 6 charges of lying, 2 counts of making false statements to the government, and 4 tax offenses. His lawyers have challenged the decision, and the case is still pending. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's Lieber's participation in the 1,000 Talents program that's bothering the American government. The 1,000 Talents program was established in 2008, and apparently in 10 years it recruited about 7,000 well-educated and highly skilled researchers from all over the world. Its official website shows that it involves more than what we might simply call international exchange. China is not simply interested in people who have an outstanding intellectual track record. As the program's outline explained, When gifted recruits go to China, they are playing, and I quote, a positive role in the scientific innovation, technological breakthrough, discipline construction, talent training, and high-tech industry development. They are an important force in the construction of an innovative country. These government-funded programs are embedded in an overall agenda that seeks to transform China into a global economic power by the mid-21st century. The Made in China 2025 plan, launched in 2015, has singled out 10 key sectors in which China seeks to secure a dominant share of the global market explicitly, right? They are central to the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution. Some of their foci, like artificial intelligence, robotics, manufacturing supply, autonomous vehicles, augmented reality, and so forth, will be generic so that many applications and end-use technologies can be built upon them. They are part of a science and technology-driven innovation strategy that sees investment in innovation as contributing to nation building. China regards these programs as a legitimate instrument for economic and military modernization. For the Chinese government of Xi Jinping, and here we get to it, access to foreign science and technology is a national imperative. Here's what the Central Committee of the Communist Party and State Council put, this is how they put it. The important reason for the backwardness and beatings of China, which they're very, of course, sensitive about, right? Obviously so, and obviously so, in modern times, is that it has lost contact with previous scientific and technological revolutions. This, they say, will not happen again. Innovation drive is the destiny of the country. For the Chinese authorities, talent recruitment programs will help realize the Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's part of a vast historical project, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. For the US, these programs are being used to advance Chinese economic dominance over us, America, using economic espionage and intellectual property theft. Now, Lieber is fully immersed in this process. His CV states that he's published over 340 papers in peer-reviewed journals, and is the principal investigator on no more than 35 patents. Lieber has been active in commercializing nanotechnology and has founded the nanotechnology companies NanoSys Incorporated in 2001 and a new nanotech sensor company called NanoSys, a new nanotech company called Vista Therapeutics in 2007. Excuse me. These multiple skills were sought after by the Chinese authorities, who compensated him handsomely for his work. Lieber was contracted to make strategic, visionary, and creative strategic research proposals that would meet China's national strategic development requirements. He would establish a joint Harvard, WT Harvard Joint Nano Key Laboratory. While working at or for WT, he would be declaring international cooperation projects, cultivating young researchers and PhD students, organizing international conferences, applying for patents, and publishing articles in the name of WUT. Applying for patents and publishing articles in the name of WUT. So he's an American researcher applying for patents in the name of WUT. Okay. Lieber was not simply a scientific partner. He was an institution builder and educator whose research in Wuhan was shaped by strategic plans of the Chinese authorities. You can hardly wonder that the American government is rather bothered about what he's up to. Right, now I move to my conclusion. On March the 1st, 2022, 41 distinguished academics, including 6 US Nobel Prize winners, signed an open letter on Twitter deploring what they said a tragically misguided government campaign that is discouraging US scientists from collaborating with peers in other countries, particularly China. They insisted that most of Lieber's misdemeanors should have been handled by the university itself, not criminalized by the government. And many of you may agree with that, of course. Huh? But no matter, the government thought differently. In supporting Lieber, they said they were standing up for his outstanding scientific record and the fundamental concepts of scholarly collaboration, academic freedom, and scientific advancement. They added weight to their argument by pointing out that a distinguished professor of mechanical engineering, George Cheng at MIT, who'd been accused by the government of lying about his activities with China, had none at all. So once again, the FBI got it wrong. As I said, just shows how incompetent the government is. For the signatories of this letter, international scientific collaboration in fundamental research was an unassailable value, essential to the advancement of American science itself. From their perspective, there was no need to consider what knowledge Liebe actually shared with his Chinese students and faculty, colleagues at Wuhan. Fundamental research is, after all, the property of all humanity. So what's wrong with him sharing it? But what if we look and actually ask ourselves, well, what did Liebe do at Wuhan exactly? What was he expected to do in specific terms? He signed a contract with Wuhan, and this is what it said. Advanced research and development of nanowire-based lithium-ion batteries with high performance for electric vehicles. His expertise in nanotechnology, as reported by the Hong Kong South China Morning Post, promises to revolutionize energy consumption, manufacturing and green technologies, potentially touching many strategic sectors in Beijing's Made in China 2025 blueprint to upgrade its economy. Liebe, in short, was contributing to capacity building in Xi Jinping's China in a field of intense economic competition between the PRC and the United States, not to say the rest of the world. As the affidavit filed by the Department of Justice put it, Liebe was recruited to further Chinese scientific development, economic prosperity, and national security. It's hardly surprising that the American government tackled him head-on and tried to trap him and accuse him of all sorts of misdemeanors. The commercialization of research, the increased commingling of fundamental research with economic and military scientific and technological advances, the growing importance of exploiting dual-use knowledge systems like AI, and the struggle for geopolitical dominance between democratic and authoritarian regimes have undermined the basic principle of scientific internationalism. International scientific collaboration, and that's all that Liebe thought he presented himself as doing, has become entangled with the foreign policies of national governments. It is being heavily restricted in relationships with China. It is being weaponized in relationships with Russia and used along with military aid and sanctions to oppose the invasion of Ukraine. And here's what you may not like me to say. We cannot reasonably oppose it by appealing just like that to scientific internationalism. I'm not saying that we abandon these values altogether. Of course not. I'm only arguing that we do not uncritically appeal to openness, as did these 41 scientists and engineers, as did those 41 eminent scientists, scholars who published a spirited defense of their Harvard colleague, basically because they hated Donald Trump. Instead, we have to carefully consider the content of the knowledge and the know-how that is being shared, with whom it is being shared, and with what country it is being shared, and what its economic and military implications are. We have to accept, whether we like it or not, that there are limits on the scope of scientific internationalism and of science diplomacy in the name of national, economic, and military interests. And we have to play, we as scientists and engineers, and I'm speaking to us there as a scientist and engineer, have to play a constructive role in defining where those limits are. If we do not decide where the limits lie, the national intelligence community will decide it for us. And believe you me, I've heard people from the FBI and the CIA talk about this problem because I had access to some of these lectures. They have no idea where to draw this boundary. So they just draw it more or less arbitrarily. It's up to us as scientists and engineers to become involved in this problem that we face now, do the transformation of our research fields, and not simply appeal more or less instinctively to the principle of scientific internationalism to plead for the free circulation of knowledge. We need to contribute to the process of regulation of that knowledge and make sure that it's limited to the minimum, but not deny that it's necessary to some extent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for this fascinating talk. And I now open the floor to questions, comments, and I start with Juan Carlos de Martin.
Thank you, Professor Krige, for this wonderful talk. Just reacting to the last part of your lecture, I found that there is an enormous amount of hypocrisy in the case of Charles Lieber, because looking at the developments of the last 30 years, we've seen thousands of US and European companies opening research and development labs in China, with thousands of European and American researchers physically being present in China, hundreds of factories which were joint ventures between American companies, European companies, and Chinese government, with the knowledge sharing implied and explicitly implied. So I wonder whether the case of Liber is, to quote the Chinese, punish one to educate 1,000.
Yeah, that's one way of describing what the American government is doing. Yes, of course, of course. From the 1990s onwards, beginning with Clinton, and that's the real irony of it all, there was a huge effort made to encourage collaboration with China. There's no question about that. Beginning in 1990 and right up to the Obama period, there's strong pressure on everyone, and I myself have taught in China. Georgia Tech has a huge campus in Shenzhen. It trains lots of people in China. Of course, Berkeley has, everybody has a campus in China and loves going there. So yes, there's been, what I'm of course insisting on is that China has taken off with such extreme rapidity. You know, if you look at the R&D statistics for China, state investment in R&D, it was roughly 0 in 2000. Today, as percentage of GDP, it's bigger than the United States. The number of PhDs trained in China are enormous now compared to even 20 years ago. So the change has happened that we contributed massively to this transformation of the Chinese research and development ecosystem. And now people are beginning to worry, and above all, because of the claims that Xi Jinping has made. Xi Jinping has explicitly said that China seeks to take a dominant position in world markets and a dominant position globally. And of course, when the United States hear that somebody wants to knock them out of a dominant position, they get very, very concerned about it. Whether or not we want to get concerned about it is, I suppose, up to us. But as you know, the European Union itself is becoming worried about this. The European Union is itself beginning to think about how should we define our relationship with China, as a collaborative one, or should we see China as a systemic rival? And there's no question about it that there is more and more concern about China being seen as a systemic rival. So I think I think it's fair to say that we have massively contributed to it, but there's a massive revaluation of the situation, and that Liber is exactly being punished because he's such a high-profile person. Personally, I think, and a highly unscrupulous person, in my view, right, that we are beginning to realize that we cannot go on simply doing this without thinking carefully about who we are collaborating with and what knowledge we are sharing with them. And places like MIT now have a whole internal evaluation system before you even make an apply for a grant involving China to see whether you will put any sensitive knowledge at risk. So the universities are playing along with this more and more as well, and it's probably coming our way too. Should it be done? Should it not be done? I think it has to be done. Yes, I do think it has to be done. I don't particularly want China to be the dominant force in the world at the moment. I would much prefer a multipolar world. I absolutely do not think we should cut off all our relations with China. I have lots of students of my own there and links. I think we should keep those going, but I also think we can't particularly simply evade the problem that is here by claiming that international scientific collaboration is a good thing and it's a historical thing and we should continue doing it. I think we should talk carefully and discuss carefully who we deal with and what kind of knowledge we're sharing, and if it's in the interests of our own economies, quite frankly. Frankly, I mean, if Liber gives away all this fantastic new knowledge about electric batteries, that's really bad news for the European automobile industry. Already we have enough bad news, but if he gives away all his best knowledge to China in developing electric batteries with lithium and nanowire technology techniques, well, I think that's hard on us, and we should defend ourselves from it happening.
Thanks a lot. There are two questions. If you want to raise a question or ask a comment, please raise your hand. Roberto Pagani.
Nice. Your conclusions were strong, powerful, correct. I do agree very much. We need to know where we have to stay, where to stay, otherwise others will decide in place of us.
Exactly, exactly.
I'm talking as former science counselor, scientific attaché of the Italian government in Shanghai, in China. So yes. I've been living 6 years, and I just back to Politecnico Torino a few months ago. So I know the topic quite well.
I'm sure you do.
My question, first, we had an incredible rise of collaborations between Italy, Europe, and China in the last years. When I went to Shanghai in 2016, we had 573 university collaborations, and when I'm back is 1,000, almost 1,000.
Incredible.
The same we have with the United States. So in terms of numbers, and also in terms of quality. My question, what is your opinion on what will do China, how will react against the block on the enabling technologies such as semiconductors?
Yeah, right.
And do you think they will stay 10 years behind in the next future, or they will react?
Thank you.
I mean,
thank you for coming, because I heard you might come, and I'm delighted that you are here and that you sort of you understand where I'm coming from, and I appreciate that. Of course, they will react. Obviously, they're extremely. Huawei has suffered a huge amount from the attack on Huawei as a listed entity by the United States. I think they've shrunk to 25% of their initial strength. There's no doubt that this attack by Biden is unprecedented. It is spoken of in terms of killing the Chinese semiconductor industry. Of course, the Americans love this kind of bellicose language, strangling, choking, killing the Chinese semiconductor industry. And China must and will react. But the point is that the range of measures that have been taken are so comprehensive, and the power of American law is so extensive, that even firms in Europe that, of course, as you know, export controls are extraterritorial. So American law to technology sharing with China applies to European companies that deal with America as well. And they will be sanctioned by the United States. So a German firm, an Italian firm that deals with China in the semiconductor industry will fall under American law if it has any links at all with America, and will be sanctioned by the United States. It's a massive assault on the Chinese semiconductor industry. So of course, the first thing to say, it's only high-end semiconductors. So China is really well advanced, in fact, far ahead of us in many others, like, for example, automatic cities, automatic shopping malls. You know, of course, you've seen these automatic shopping centers in China where you never see a human being. You do all your shopping with your chariot, and then you go out and you pay, and you never see anybody. Everything is fully automated. There's pattern recognition for who you are, etc., etc. So, and automatic vehicles, that is for solar, they're way ahead. So a lot of the areas will not be touched. There's a high end that will be touched. That's the first thing. And of course, China will try to catch up. But and because they also control knowledge flows and not just technology, people who have that knowledge, any American citizen or green card holder who knows anything about semiconductors may not work with a Chinese company any longer, or a company that has dealings with China. So American law then applies to an Italian, brilliant Italian material scientist who has a green card. He may not work for China any longer. He will be sanctioned by the United States, or she. You know, in my gloomiest moments, I think China might invade Taiwan to get hold of TMC, actually. I mean, that might be one thing it'll do. Everybody assures me China will not invade Taiwan, but I don't think they will, but that must have crossed Xi Jinping's mind. They will try. They're brilliant people, obviously, and brilliant researchers, but I think they've probably lost a decade, at least. And I suppose, because they always manage to catch up and overtake eventually, but it is a serious and hard blow to them. I don't know if you agree with that. Thank you.
Roberto Mezzalama. I'm one of the external members of the board of the university, so I'm not an academic, but maybe from the outside, I think there's another question maybe beside the points you made that are all pretty valid, by the way, so I agree with you. The point is, isn't the academic world kind of so in the branch where it's sitting in by working with authoritarian regimes, freely sharing with authoritarian regimes? Because, one of the tenets of free academic research is, that you live in a free world, yes, exactly. That you live in a democracy.
Exactly.
When you're dealing with a country that is not a democracy, when you're empowering a system that is not democratic, you're actually invalidating one of the fundamental reasons why you are able to do free research.
Yes, of course, I agree with that. I mean, and of course, particularly because the knowledge that you share can actually enhance the power of that authoritarian regime to your disadvantage. So it's totally...
John, can you
Oh,
talk
I'm
to
sorry.
the mic?
I'm sorry. Also because the knowledge that you share can enhance the power of that regime. That's what's significant about this knowledge. It's not just really, like an astrophysicist can say this because frankly, knowing about handling the three-body problem in the outer galaxy is not really going to make a big difference to anybody's national power. But working on electric batteries is going to make a big difference. So yes, I'm afraid that, I mean, the point is, yes, we do face a dilemma, an unprecedented dilemma, I think, and therefore we have to grapple with it. We can't hide behind the principles of openness and freedom of exchange any longer. And, you know, open access is a really big and complicated issue because many American engineers that I speak to are dead against open access because they say, well, we're just giving everything to China for nothing, right? Of course, it's meant with good intentions to enable people, especially from less advanced, less developed countries, to have access to our pool of scientific knowledge and information. But it can be grasped by other people who we're not particularly pleased to work with and used by them. So open access runs into a lot of opposition with some American engineers that I know. So I think we have a huge series of issues to face up to. I don't think we're ready for it yet, but my talk is meant to begin to make us and myself think about getting ready for it. And you know, it's really complicated because it depends on the knowledge that you want to share. I deal with some people at the University of British Columbia, which has a very good agricultural research department. And I discussed this issue with somebody there, and he said, you know, I've done a lot of work on genetically modified seeds. And my work shows massively how to improve the output and the yield of these seeds. And he says, China takes my work and runs with it. And I said, does that bother you? He said, it doesn't bother me at all. Because anybody who improves the yield of seeds is contributing to global sustainability and to eliminating poverty. And if it's going to be China, let it be China. I don't mind. Of course, a lot of people would say that's totally wrong of him. But you can see here that he's got a conflict between the values of the UN sustainability goals and removing global poverty and contributing to that, and knowing that China has the money and the determination to use that knowledge, and others who think you shouldn't do anything at all with China. So it's a real dilemma, and it has to be treated case by case. And it comes down to really what is the knowledge I'm sharing, with who am I sharing it, and how can it be used? And I think that's where the issue becomes important and where we should, as scientists, I think, and engineers, and I was one, face up to our responsibilities to take those and contribute to a debate, at least, about those issues. Thank you.
There is another question by Vera Tripodi.
Thank you, Professor Krige, for your talk. I'm a philosopher, and the last part of your talk, you have mentioned the issue of limit. So as a philosopher, I'm just wondering what kind of ethical criteria we should endorse in order to establish where the limit is.
Yeah, well...
Thank you.
So I'm not a philosopher. So it's very tricky for me. The limit is a socially negotiated limit. That's number one. And the values that are built into that limit will, of course, be political and ethical. And I think it depends very much on the case. I mean, with electric batteries, I mean, the limit is clearly going to be something like economic strength. With genetically modified foods, the limit's going to be very much ethical, right? About to what extent do we have a social responsibility to poorer people, to developing countries. So I think it depends on the case and the particular kind of ethical judgments that you want to bring to bear. My judgment of Liebe is not ethical. It's straight political. Okay, but I can see circumstances in which there are ethical ones. You might, of course, mix, I mean, ethical and political might go together when you have questions of human rights, right? Perhaps you would believe that given the way the Chinese treat the Uyghurs, or accused of treating the Uyghurs, we should have nothing to do with them whatsoever. In which case, it doesn't matter what the content of them, we should withdraw all our campuses from China, for example. So it depends on the specific ethical value concerned, and the specific situation that you're discussing. As always in academia, the point is to be specific, not to hide behind generalized, stereotypical generalizations, because they're a nightmare, these stereotypes. They block all discussion, they block all analysis, and they leave a huge space open to people who are actually making policy and take decisions, because they have no guidance. about specificities. They just work on generalities. And that we have to avoid, including in our dealing with China, and including in my dealing with China. I have to avoid that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the audience if there are other questions.
Thank you for your enthralling talk. I'm Sid Reynolds from CY University in Paris.
Okay.
I find it very interesting that you mentioned the fact there is a change of status of the relation between the United States and USSR and on the one hand and with China on the other hand, because probably the military threat changed to an economic threat.
Yeah.
Ironically, the fact that science belonged to what we call the common is a very Western concept. I'm not sure this is the case for China. And probably it might be interesting to wonder if there might not be a permanent change in the nature of science and knowledge and in the future from belonging to a common to a strongly merchandised one. What is your take on this?
Oh, that the commercialization and the commodification of scientific knowledge is absolutely happening. There's no doubt. And the American academic community took the lead in doing that. So when they complain about the fact that that's having certain nefarious consequences, they say, well, why did you go down that road in the first place then? Yeah, but we're in it now, and we'll never go back. That's why I use the word irreversible, right, in my title. And so, yes, I mean, I think the nature of knowledge is changing. The nature and the production, the production of knowledge has changed dramatically, led by the United States, and more and more here too, right, as we move closer to a kind of system in which the state leaves individuals to develop and energize their own research systems and find their own research money from the private sector. Yes, I think the notion of the commons is an enlightenment value, precisely that, the wonderful idea of the Republic of Letters sharing their knowledge freely across time and space. Yes, I think it's obsolete, and I think it's sad that it's obsolete, obviously. I'm not celebrating what I'm talking about. I'm just deeply concerned by what has changed, by what these changes are and what they mean, and I deeply believe we must obviously defend our democratic societies and their values, and that has certain kinds of implications at the moment which are not easy to accept, but which I think we have to face up to. And it's going to take some work, intellectual work, to make that defense, to draw those lines between what we will share and what we will not share. And of course, obviously, dealing with Russia is extremely complicated. We have all of us have Russian students or Russian friends who also perhaps have Ukrainian partners. It's a can of worms. But I've even been explicit to some Russians, no, I can't support you, although I know it's sad.
Thank you very much. There is maybe time for the last question.
Okay, I don't want to ask the last question, so I hope there will be at least another one. So thank you so much for your fascinating talk. But actually, I mean, I'd like you to be possibly, I mean, to reflect upon, how, I mean, you mentioned the opportunity for the academic community to be involved in this, boundary setting exercise, as it were. How might this deliberative process look like? Because, I mean, it also involves levels of governance. I mean, on the one hand, I don't think you mentioned the MIT and committees, and I don't think we can leave it to universities, because, I mean, universities are, competing, I mean, and on the other hand, you were mentioning, I mean, people who hold, I mean, green card holders are, forbidden from, and this is totally at the system, at the national level.
Yes,
so
right.
how can it work?
So, I mean, obviously, I'm able to do this because I'm not connected into the avenues of power whatsoever. But we have at least one person in the room who is or who was. And I think that, I mean, my typical example here is a person I work with at UBC. His name is Paul Evans. He's a professor of political science, and he advises Ottawa on its policies with China. And Paul is heavily involved in discussions and debates about how to deal with China as an academic. Okay, he's a political scientist. And he and I talk a lot about these issues, and I've discussed, that's why I mentioned UBC, because I've also discussed with the science faculty there some of these issues. So the first thing we need to do is to have this debate with our own science and engineering faculties. And the second thing we need to do is to build up links with people in our governments who are responsible for Chinese policy. First of all, I suppose, in our research funding establishments, and try to get a discussion going with them on what kinds of initiatives we should encourage and which ones we should be sensitive and careful about. Because, so that at least we have a rational debate or some open debate with people involved in universities who do this research and administrators and government officials and institutions that actually implement Chinese policy. I suppose we'll need to go up to the European Commission for this. I'm in no position to do that. I mean, I'm way out of the power loop. But I mean, others are closer to it, and it's just a question of building those links and coordinating, building connections which can be of influence. I mean, Paul is constantly speaking to Ottawa. He's established himself now, and he's very depressed by what he hears. Canada's just lining up behind the United States, which is what he wants to stop. Paul believes that, of course, his values have to be mine, else we would never get on. He believes in maintaining openness with China. We must do that. The question is how, and where do we draw the line between what is permissible openness and where we should say, no, we can't do this. So that's the kind of people we need to encourage to come forward in our own universities and try to build those links with our governments and I guess eventually with the Commission. It's a long haul, but at least we should have a voice, because I can tell you, if you leave it to the American security establishment to define this, it's going to be blanket. It's so hostile. The hostility in this issue across the partisan divide. 65% of Democrats support these policies on China, hard-line policies on China, and Biden is getting even harder about it. So, I mean, and that'll be reflected in the way we treat China. I think that's totally counterproductive. So I think we should just have a voice and try to build avenues to make that voice heard. But and that's a personal, sorry, that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank again John Krige for this wonderful first event of the CEUS, and I invite you all to the light lunch and we can continue the conversation there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for coming. Thanks for your attention.